The dresser had been there so long it had worn grooves into the floorboards, shallow impressions pressed into the wood like a signature. Renee Calloway noticed them the first time she crouched down to measure the wall space, running 2 fingers along the dips where the feet had sunk, and she thought about how many years it took for something that heavy to leave a mark like that. Years. Maybe decades. The dresser itself was enormous, a dark oak piece with a cracked mirror attached to the top, one of the drawer handles missing, the remaining ones tarnished past any reasonable hope of polishing. It had been left behind by whoever lived in this house before the bank took it, and then before the county took it from the bank, and then before the tax lien office put it on a list that nobody who mattered ever bothered to read. Renee had read it. She'd read it 3 times, sitting in the county clerk's office on her lunch break with a printout she'd folded and refolded until the creases were soft as fabric, because that's what happened when you had 45 minutes and nowhere else to go and a piece of paper that might mean something or might mean nothing at all. The house at 14 Aldercroft Road had been listed for delinquent property taxes at a total outstanding balance of $4,200. The structure itself was described in county records as a single-family dwelling, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, built approximately 1941, current condition unknown. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Current condition unknown. That phrase had sat in Renee's chest for 2 weeks before she finally drove out to look at it. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She didn't tell her sister Gail, who would have listed every reason it was a terrible idea in ascending order of catastrophe. She didn't tell her coworker Denise, who would have told her to spend the money on a security deposit somewhere reasonable. She drove out on a Thursday evening after her shift at the medical billing office, still in her work clothes, 3-year-old Maren asleep in the back seat with her cheek pressed to the window glass. The house sat at the end of a gravel driveway that had mostly returned to weeds. The porch roof sagged on the left side, pulling away from the house where the support post had given out. 2 windows were boarded. The yard was more meadow than lawn, wild grasses gone to seed pressing up against the foundation. And somewhere in the tangle of overgrowth on the east side there was a tree that had fallen long enough ago that smaller trees were now growing out of its rotted trunk. The mailbox at the end of the drive leaned at a 40-degree angle, its door hanging open, its flag snapped off at some point nobody witnessed. Renee sat in her car at the end of the driveway with the engine running and Maren still asleep, and she looked at the house for a long time. She was 31 years old, and she had $912 in savings. She had a lease that was up in 6 weeks and a landlord who'd already told her he was increasing the rent by $240 a month because the market supported it, said it apologetically, almost kindly, the way people told you bad news when they wanted credit for the delivery. She had a job that paid $22 an hour and a daughter who needed stable ground beneath her feet more than anything else in the world, and she had a paper in her purse that said a house could be hers for $4,200 if she could prove the funds at the county tax office before the deadline printed at the bottom of the listing. $4,200. She had $912. She drove home with Maren still asleep and spent the next week calling her mother, calling Gail, calling her friend Patricia, who'd once said, "Call me if you ever really need something." She called the credit union about a personal loan. She talked to her tax preparer about a refund advance. She sold her grandmother's pearl earrings on a resale app for $230 and felt sick about it for a day, then felt something harder than sick settle in and replace it. 6 days before the tax lien deadline, she had $4,380 cobbled together from sources she'd have to spend the next year repaying, and she drove to the county office on her lunch break and signed the papers. Gail called that evening. "Renee, what have you done?" It wasn't a question. It was the whole sentence flattened out, drained of inflection, the way her sister said things when she was too tired to be angry. "I bought a house." "You bought a condemned building." "It's not condemned." The county would have listed it as condemned. The county listed it as condition unknown. That means nobody wanted to know. Renee didn't argue with that. She looked at Maren, who was sitting on the kitchen floor constructing a tower out of cereal boxes with the focused intensity of an architect, and she said, "I have 6 weeks before I lose this apartment anyway. At least this is mine." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough to count. Then Gail said, "I'll come help you clean it out. But I'm telling you right now, if there's a body in there, I'm leaving." There wasn't a body. There was something else entirely. The first week at the house was spent on the basics, which is to say the first week was spent discovering that basics were not basic at all. The water ran when you turned the taps, which was something, but it ran the color of weak tea for the first several minutes and smelled faintly mineral, like coins held in a palm. The electricity had been cut off at the meter and Renee paid to have it restored, $160, money she didn't entirely have, but spent anyway because Maren was afraid of the dark in a way she'd never been in their apartment, where the city lights pressed through the curtains, even at midnight. Here the darkness at night was absolute and complete, and 3 years old had no vocabulary for it. Gail came that first Saturday with her truck, her teenage son Marcus, and a reluctance she wore openly like a coat she hadn't bothered to hang up. She walked through the house with her arms crossed, not touching anything, cataloging damage with the thoroughness of someone who'd worked in property management for 12 years and had learned to see the worst case first. The bathroom tile is pulling away from the wall, which means moisture behind it, which means probably mold. I know. The kitchen ceiling has a water stain the size of a dining table. I know. Whatever was living in the walls of the back bedroom. I know, Gail. Her sister stopped in the hallway and looked at her. Renee, I love you. This is going to cost you more money than you have to fix. You could have taken the refund advance and put it toward a proper deposit somewhere. Somewhere that raises rent every year. Somewhere Maren and I get pushed out of every time the market moves. Gail looked at the walls, the cracked plaster, the baseboard pulling away from the floor in the front room. Then she looked at her sister. Where do you want me to start? They started in the kitchen and worked outward through the days. Renee learned to use a putty knife. She learned the difference between a crack that was structural and a crack that was just old plaster giving up against gravity. She learned that water damage was the whole story of a neglected house, that every problem she found traced back eventually to water that had gotten in somewhere and stayed. She also learned that the house, beneath the layers of neglect, was built well. The bones, as Marcus said, having heard his mother use the phrase his whole life, were solid. The framing was tight. The foundation had no cracks worth worrying about. Someone had built this house in 1941 to last, and it had lasted, and it was still here waiting. Maren adapted faster than Renee expected. Children had a flexibility that adults had to excavate from themselves through effort, and Maren took to the house the way she took to most things, with curiosity and without the weight of everything it could mean. She adopted the backyard as her territory, spending hours in the overgrown grass identifying bugs with a picture book she'd gotten from the library, bringing specimens to show Renee on leaves held flat, like offerings. Mommy, this one has spots. Mommy, this one has too many legs. Is that normal? It was normal. Most things were normal, when you looked closely enough. It was Maren who found it. 3 weeks into their time in the house, on a Sunday afternoon when Renee was repainting the front room walls and Maren had been given the job of stirring the second can of paint, which was a fiction they both participated in, Maren wandered into the main bedroom, where the enormous oak dresser stood against the south wall. Renee heard her daughter's footsteps, the particular pattern that meant she was exploring rather than playing, a slower and more deliberate rhythm. She heard the sound of small hands pressed to wood, the dresser being pushed experimentally. Maren had developed a theory about all the furniture in the house, which was that things left behind had been left for her specifically, and that her job was to understand why. Mom. Renee kept her roller moving. Mom. Something in the second call was different. Not alarmed, not frightened. Different in a way that made Renee set the roller in the tray and walk down the hallway. Maren was standing beside the dresser with both palms pressed against its side, pushing. The dresser had shifted perhaps 2 inches, enough to reveal a sliver of wall that had been hidden behind it for what appeared to be a very long time. The wallpaper that covered the rest of the room's walls was missing from this section, which made a kind of sense. If the dresser had stood here long enough, whoever put the wallpaper up had simply worked around it. The plaster here was bare and slightly yellowed with age, and on it, written in dark ink that had dried to the color of old rust, were words. Not just words, lines of them, careful and even, as though someone had taken their time. Maren said, Mom, there's writing on the wall behind the dresser. Renee looked at it. She sat down on the floor. She sat down because her legs did a thing they sometimes did when something struck her from the direction she wasn't watching, a kind of sudden emptying that started at the knees. She sat on the dusty floorboards of this house she had spent $4,380 acquiring and looked at handwriting that had been hidden behind a massive oak dresser for so long the plaster around it had changed color, and she felt the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something whose depth she couldn't yet measure. Maren sat down beside her. "What does it say?" Renee read it. The writing began near the top of the exposed section, where the dresser's mirror frame would have rested against the wall, and continued in neat, even rows to a point just above the baseboard. Someone had written in a careful hand, the letters formed with deliberate precision, the lines spaced as though the writer had known they needed room. The ink was old enough to have lost its original darkness, fading toward amber and rust, but the words were still legible. The first line read, "To whoever lives here after us, I hope this finds you in better times than we left." Renee read those words twice without moving. Maren was watching her face the way 3-year-olds watch their mothers' faces when they were trying to read weather. The writing continued. "My name is Dorothy Marsh. I lived in this house from 1941 until 1974, 33 years, which is most of my life on this earth. My husband Leonard built this house with his hands and the help of his brother Frank, who drove down from Pittsburgh to help frame the walls. Leonard was particular about the framing. He said if you got the framing right, everything else could be fixed, but if you got it wrong, everything else would eventually fail. I think about that often." Renee read slowly, following each line to its end before moving to the next. "We raised 3 children here: Carol, James, and Robert. Carol moved to Phoenix in 1966 when she married. James died in 1969. He was 22. And if you know the years, you will know why, and I will not write more about that here because some grief does not reduce to sentences. Robert still lives in Millbrook County as of this writing. He and his wife have a dairy farm on the Route 7 corridor. I am writing this in 1974, which is the year Leonard passed and the year I have decided I can no longer maintain this house alone. I am moving to be near Carol and Phoenix. I do not know what will happen to this house. I have tried to sell it properly, but the market is poor, and I have had only one offer, which was so low it seemed less like an offer and more like an insult to everything Leonard built. I cannot accept it, so I am leaving it in the hands of whatever comes next. There are things I want whoever comes next to know." Renee stopped reading and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Maren, sitting close enough that their arms were touching, said nothing. She had learned, in 3 years of watching her mother navigate things, when to be quiet. Renee read on. "The first thing is about the house itself. The east wall of the root cellar, the one that faces the old property line, has a false panel. Leonard built it in 1943 when he was convinced, for a period of 2 years, that there would be a German invasion of the eastern seaboard. I tell you this not because of what is behind it now, which is mostly Leonard's woodworking tools and a collection of Jared preserves I am too sentimental to discard, but because you should know it is there. False things in a house have a way of causing problems if you don't know about them. Structural work, plumbing, anything that involves the east wall of that cellar, know that the panel comes off if you press the lower left corner. The second thing is harder to write. Behind this dresser, which I have not moved since 1958 when Leonard put it here and declared it a permanent feature of the architecture, there is a space inside the wall. It is not a structural space. Leonard made it deliberately, a cavity between the studs with a small door set flush to the plaster so that it disappeared. You can find it by pressing the baseboard trim on the left side of where this dresser stands. The trim piece will pivot. Behind it is the door. We kept things there over the years. Important documents. Money, during hard times, when the bank felt less trustworthy than the walls of our own home. Leonard's army discharge papers. My mother's letters from Germany before the war. When I leave this house, I am leaving several things in that space. I am doing this partly because some of them have nowhere better to go, and partly because I have a feeling which is not rational, but which I trust anyway that they may matter to someone, someday, in ways I cannot predict. I have left a record of everything in the blue tin on the dresser top. You will need the record to understand what you have found. Renee looked up. There was no blue tin on the dresser top. There was a dried ring where something circular had sat for long enough to leave a ghost of itself in the dust, but the tin itself was gone. Her stomach dropped in a way she recognized as the body's response to being presented with something taken away before you'd had a chance to reach for it. But the letter was still here. The letter was still here because the dresser was still here, because no one had known to move it, because the grocery of the ordinary, the heavy furniture, the neglect, the years had protected the words underneath from everything that had swept through this house in the decades since Dorothy Marsh had walked out the front door and driven to Phoenix. Renee, read the rest. I know I am writing to a stranger. Maybe many strangers, in sequence. Houses collect people and people leave, and what remains is the impression of them, the way weight leaves impressions in floorboards. If you are reading this, you are sleeping in the rooms where my children grew up. You are walking on the floors Leonard leveled by hand with a spirit level he ordered from a catalog in 1940. The kitchen window that faces east shows the sunrise in a particular way in early November, a low orange light that fills the whole room for about 40 minutes. And I would like you to know that existed so that someone, even a stranger, will remember to look for it. I hope the house has been good to you. I hope the framing held. I hope you were kind to it, and it returned the favor, because that is how houses work, the same as most things. If what is behind the wall is still there, and I believe it will be, because I believe in walls built with intention, I want you to have it. All of it. Without condition. You are living in this house, and that makes it yours in the way that matters. Good luck to you. Dorothy Marsh, September 1974. Renee sat on the floor for a long time after she finished reading. She read it again from the beginning. The second reading was different from the first, the way second readings always were. The shock absorbed enough now that she could hear the voice behind the words rather than just the words themselves. Dorothy Marsh had not written with self-pity, and she had not written with the particular performance of generosity that people sometimes used when leaving things to strangers. The gesture made large to compensate for the fact that it cost nothing. She had written practically and personally, the way you wrote to someone you expected to be real. She had told her about the sunrise in November through the east-facing kitchen window. She had told her about Leonard's philosophy of framing. She had described her son James without naming what happened to him, only naming the year, and trusted whoever read it to understand. Renee had been 22 in 2001 when the towers came down. She'd grown up knowing what 1969 meant in terms of young men and their years. James had been 22. She folded that knowledge into the letter and read the rest again and felt the full weight of it settle, which was not the weight of treasure. She didn't know yet what anything was worth, and she had enough self-awareness to know that hope was a way of getting hurt, but the weight of being trusted. Dorothy Marsh had trusted the house. The house had waited. And Renee had arrived at the end of a sequence of events that had felt like nothing but pressure and scarcity and exhaustion, and had bought a condemned but not actually condemned structure for $4,000 from a county that listed it as condition unknown. She thought about the chain, about every decision that had to happen in exactly the sequence it happened to bring her to this floor on this afternoon, with her 3-year-old sitting close and a dead woman's handwriting on the wall. Maren eventually climbed into her lap, which she still did when she sensed her mother needed anchoring. She didn't ask what the letter said. She was 3, and she'd heard the voice her mother used when reading, the way it slowed and stopped and started again, and she'd understood the shape of it even without the words. She pressed her hand flat against Renee's collarbone the way she did when she wanted her mother's heartbeat, and Renee held her there and breathed and looked at the wall. What's behind the wall, Mommy? I don't know yet. Are we going to look? Yes. Renee stood up. Her knees were dusty from the floor, and her hands were still faintly stained with the paint she'd been rolling when Maren called her, and she looked at the baseboard on the left side of where the dresser stood. She pressed the trim piece. Nothing happened immediately. Then she pressed harder, at the lower corner as Dorothy had written, and felt a give in the wood, the subtle compression of something designed to move. The trim piece pivoted on a hidden axis, and behind it was a small metal latch, the kind that required a half-turn, painted over so many times in the decades since Leonard built it that it had nearly disappeared into the wall. Renee worked it with her fingernail, then with a flathead screwdriver she got from the kitchen drawer, and after several minutes of patient work it turned. A section of baseboard and plaster, maybe 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall, swung inward. The space behind it was dark. Renee got her phone's flashlight and knelt down and shone it into the cavity. She had been expecting the things Dorothy described. Jarred preserves, long since ruined. Old documents crumbling at the edges. The detritus of a life packed carefully into a wall. She found those things. But she also found something else. 3 things she hadn't expected, sitting at the back of the cavity in the dark that had kept them since 1974. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first was a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, the paper brown at the edges but intact. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was European in its formation, the particular style of someone who learned to write in a different language first, and the return address was a city in Germany that had been divided by a wall for most of the time these letters existed. The second was a small wooden box, simple and undecorated, with a brass clasp that still turned. Inside the box, pressed into a bed of deteriorating velvet, were 6 coins. Renee was not a person who knew about coins. She could see they were old, the surfaces worn smooth in places, the faces bearing images that were not American, the edges milled in patterns that seemed to indicate age and care. They were the size of silver dollars. They were not silver dollars. The third was a canvas pouch, the kind that banks once used for coin deposits, closed with a drawstring that had stiffened over the decades but still held. Renee worked the drawstring open with careful fingers, feeling the contents shift inside, and when she turned the pouch over and let what was inside slide into her palm, she sat back on her heels and went completely still. 18 pieces, each about the size of a poker chip, each the unmistakable deep yellow of something that was not brass and not gold-tinted and not any kind of decorative reproduction. They were irregular in their thickness and their edges were not machine-cut. They were the kind of thing that had been shaped by a process older than minting. They were the kind of thing that Leonard Marsh had apparently trusted to his own walls more than he had trusted any bank. Renee sat in the cavity's open doorway with 18 pieces of what appeared to be raw gold on her palm and her daughter standing behind her asking if there were bugs, and she stared at what she was holding and tried to think. She didn't know what she had. She understood that she didn't know. She understood that not knowing was the only honest response to this moment, and that anything else would be the kind of thinking that got people into trouble, the leap from possibility to certainty that caused 1,000 ordinary disasters, and occasionally, in stories, something else. Maren peered around her shoulder. What are those? I'm not sure yet. They're shiny. Yes. Are they treasure? Renee closed her fingers carefully around the pieces in her palm. Maybe. We're going to find out. She replaced everything exactly where she'd found it, which required an act of will she hadn't anticipated needing. The coins went back into their velvet box. The letters went back in their bundle. The canvas pouch went back with its contents arranged the way she'd found them. She pushed the wall door closed and turned the latch and replaced the baseboard trim and stepped back and looked at the wall. Then she did something that would have seemed strange to anyone watching, which was that she pulled her phone out and took a photograph of Dorothy Marsh's letter. She photographed every line, methodically, starting from the top. She had a reason for this. She wasn't sure yet what the reason was exactly. Only that documentation was what careful people did when they encountered something they didn't yet understand. That evening, after Maren was asleep in the back bedroom that now had a working night light and 3 stuffed animals arranged in a specific order that could not be altered, Renee sat at the kitchen table with her phone and began to look up what she'd found. She made herself tea first, which was a habit she'd developed in the years since Maren was born, the small ritual of doing something ordinary when ordinary felt distant. She'd been a person who drank coffee until the 3rd trimester, when coffee turned on her and the switch to tea had stayed, had become part of the architecture of who she now was. She filled the mug, sat down, and let herself think about what the day had contained. She'd grown up in this county, 20 minutes from where this house stood. She'd moved to the city for a few years in her mid-20s, working at a hospital in the billing department, taking night classes toward the accounting certificate she'd eventually finished. Then Maren's father had stopped being someone she was building a life with and became instead someone whose name appeared on documents and monthly deposits. And Renee had moved back to the county where her mother and Gail still lived, closer to help, closer to the people who answered the phone. She was not a person who complained about the shape her life had taken. She understood the difference between the life she'd planned and the life she was living and had made her peace with the gap, which was not nothing, but which was also not the whole story. The whole story included Maren, who was the clearest proof that things did not need to go the way you planned to produce something worth protecting. She started with the coins. The images she'd captured before replacing the box were not professional quality, but they were clear enough to show the faces and reverse sides of each coin. She ran them through an image search, and then through a collector's forum she found linked in the results. And within 30 minutes, she had a working hypothesis that needed professional confirmation to mean anything at all, but that made her put the phone down on the table and stare at the wall. Gold coins from the early 20th century. Pre-Depression-era American pieces that had been minted in an era when the country still used gold as currency and then abruptly stopped doing so in 1933 when Roosevelt changed the rules. Pieces that collectors tracked with a specific and devoted attention because they were limited and because they were history and because some of them, in certain conditions, were worth amounts that the internet forums described in ways that seemed like errors until you read them twice and understood they were not. She did not know yet if the coins she'd found matched any particular valuable variety. She did not know the condition, which mattered enormously. She did not know anything for certain. But she knew enough to understand that the morning required a different kind of action than she'd expected to take when she woke up in this house 3 weeks ago for the first time. She looked up numismatists. She had never needed to know the word before. She found one in the county seat, 40 minutes away, whose website listed estate appraisals and antique coin evaluation as services offered, and she found a second one in the city 2 hours north whose reputation in the forum threads was described in terms that suggested authority. Then she opened the photos of the gold pieces and looked at them for a while. They were irregular. She'd noticed that when she'd held them. Not machine-produced. More like the kind of thing that came from a process of melting and cooling and cutting that predated the standardization of modern minting. That pushed them into a different category. She didn't know what category exactly. She knew enough to know she didn't know. She went to bed at midnight and didn't sleep until sometime after 3. The next morning she called her office and used 2 of her remaining vacation days, which she'd been saving with the compressed anxiety of someone who knew emergencies came without appointments. She called Gail. "I need you to watch Maren for 2 days." "Why? What's happening?" "I found something in the house. I need to get it evaluated." The silence on the other end had a different quality than the silence from 2 weeks ago when she'd said she'd bought the house. This one was the silence of someone recalibrating. "Found something like a structural problem or found something like I don't know yet. That's why I need the evaluation." Gail picked Maren up at noon. Maren went without complaint, carrying her picture book and a bag of crackers and her wooden rabbit that she'd had since infancy and still treated as a necessary object. Gail stood at the door and looked at Renee with the particular look of a sister who had seen you do foolish things and is wondering if this is another one. "Call me," Gail said. "I will." Renee packed the contents of the wall cavity into a shoebox lined with the softest cloth she could find in the house, which was an old flannel shirt she'd been using as a cleaning rag. She placed the coins in their wooden box in the center. She placed the canvas pouch, knotted closed, beside it. She put the letters in a separate, smaller box, because they required different handling and different expertise, and she understood instinctively that they were a different kind of discovery entirely. She drove to the numismatist in the county seat first, because it was closer, because she needed some information before she drove 2 hours to someone who represented more authority. The shop occupied the bottom floor of a converted Victorian on the main commercial street, its window displaying a careful arrangement of coins behind glass and a hand-painted sign that said Harold Finn, Estate Appraisals and Numismatic Evaluation, established 1978. Harold Finn was in his late 60s, with the kind of methodical patience that came from 40 years of looking at small objects through magnifying equipment. He wore a jeweler's loop on a cord around his neck and reading glasses on top of his head and a third pair of glasses on his nose, which suggested a philosophical approach to vision correction. He greeted Renee from behind a glass counter and said, "What can I do for you?" She said she'd found some coins in an old house and needed to understand what she had. She put the wooden box on the counter. Harold Finn lifted the lid, looked at the 6 coins in their velvet setting, and was quiet for a moment in a way that was professionally neutral, but that Renee noticed. He picked up the loop from around his neck and examined each coin without speaking. He turned them. He held them at angles to the shop's overhead lighting. He set them back in the box. "Where did you find these?" "In the wall of a house I just acquired." The house was built in 1941. Harold Finn folded his hands on the counter. He looked at Renee, and then at the coins, and then at Renee again. "Do you have any documentation about the provenance? Any history of the property? Previous ownership records?" "I have a letter." Renee showed him the photographs on her phone, scrolling through the images of Dorothy Marsh's wall writing slowly enough that he could read. He read carefully, asking her to scroll back twice on the section about the wall cavity. When he finished, he was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "These are St. Gaudens double eagles." Renee waited. He explained. The St. Gaudens double eagle was a $20 gold coin minted between 1907 and 1933. It was named for the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, who designed the obverse, which bore the image of Lady Liberty in motion. Many numismatists considered it the most beautiful coin ever produced by the United States Mint. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which required most gold coins to be turned in to the Federal Reserve. The majority of St. Gaudens double eagles that existed at that time were melted down. The coins that weren't turned in, that were kept, hidden, passed down through families who didn't trust the order or didn't hear about it or made the decision to keep what was theirs. Those coins became something else. Scarce, historically significant, collectible in ways that had nothing to do with their original face value of $20. Harold Finn said, "The condition will matter significantly. Let me examine them properly." He spent 45 minutes with the coins under his equipment, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. Renee sat in a chair near the window and looked at the street and tried not to interpret the occasional soft sounds he made as evidence of anything. When he came back to the counter, his expression was professionally composed, but there was something underneath it that she'd learned to read in people, a kind of controlled effort, the face people wore when they were holding something back. He said, "Based on my assessment, these 6 coins are genuine St. Gaudens double eagles." He named the specific dates, which she would not remember afterward through the noise of everything else she was thinking. He said they were in what he would classify as extremely fine to about uncirculated condition, accounting for the storage circumstances. He said that 6 coins of this type, in this condition, would at current market require a more authoritative appraisal than he could offer from his shop, and that he would recommend she drive to the city to a specific colleague of his who handled major estate pieces. He said one more thing. He said that his estimate, which she should treat as a preliminary and non-binding assessment, was that the 6 coins together could represent somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $90,000 at auction, depending on the specific varieties and a professional grading evaluation. Renee was quiet. Harold Finn waited. She said, "What about the other pieces? The ones in the pouch?" He examined those next. They were not coins. They were, as she had half guessed, gold in a more primitive form, nuggets and irregular flattened pieces that had been shaped by hand. Harold Finn weighed them on a scale he kept below the counter and tested them with a process he explained in terms she understood only partially. Acid solution and a touchstone and the particular color the mark left, which told him what he needed to know. He said they were high-purity gold. Not fine gold, not investment-grade bullion, but 90 to 92% pure based on his test, consistent with material that had been refined privately rather than commercially. 18 pieces. He weighed them together and individually. He did the arithmetic in his leather ledger. He told her the total weight in troy ounces. He told her what an ounce of gold was worth that morning, which she could verify on her phone. He told her to multiply the 2 numbers together and then multiply by 0.91 to account for purity, and that the result would be a conservative estimate of melt value, meaning the value if someone simply melted everything down, which no one would do because raw historical pieces in this condition had collector value on top of melt value. Renee did the arithmetic on her phone. She did it twice. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the number and said nothing for a long moment. Harold Finn said, gently, "You should also have the letters looked at. I'm not a documents expert, but pre-war correspondence from Germany to the United States, particularly if they involve certain historical circumstances, can have archival and historical value beyond the purely monetary." Renee looked up from her phone. There was a sound in the shop, a clock on the wall, measuring ordinary time in the same steady rhythm it had kept all morning, indifferent to everything that had just shifted. She said, "Is there someone you can call? Your colleague in the city. Can you call ahead?" Harold Finn picked up the phone on his counter. She drove 2 hours north with the shoebox in the passenger seat, which she understood was not the most secure transportation method for what might be a significant amount of wealth, but which was also the only method available to a woman who had spent the morning learning things that had reorganized the geography of her understanding. She drove carefully, She stopped once for gas and a bottle of water and stood at the pump looking at the shoebox on the seat and thought about Dorothy Marsh, who had written a letter and hidden it behind a dresser and trusted the walls of a house her husband had built with intention. She thought about the year 1974, which was the year Dorothy had left. Renee had not been alive in 1974. She had come into the world in 1992, 18 years after Dorothy Marsh had packed her life and driven to Phoenix to be near her daughter. She thought about all the things that had happened in this house in those 18 years between Dorothy's departure and Renee's birth. Someone had lived here, or tried to, or left it empty. The wallpaper that covered most of the bedroom had gone up at some point after 1974 because Dorothy's writing would have been papered over otherwise. Someone had put that wallpaper up without moving the dresser, which told her something about the kind of person that someone was working around what was heavy rather than through it, leaving problems for later in the way that people did when they were managing too much already. She understood that. She had done it herself, more times than she'd want to count. She thought about how Gail had called the house a condemned building and how she'd said it wasn't condemned, and she'd been right about the technical definition, and Gail had been right about the spirit of it. The house had been a version of condemned, had been a building that the systems around it had decided wasn't worth the effort of caring for, and Renee had bought it anyway with money she didn't quite have for reasons that were partly practical and partly something she didn't have a clean word for. Stubbornness. Instinct. The refusal to accept that the only thing available to her was the kind of stability that came with someone else's name on the lease. The shoebox sat on the passenger seat in a shaft of October sunlight, and Renee drove north and didn't let herself finish any of the thoughts she kept starting about what the numbers might mean. The numismatist in the city was named Carl Bremer, and he had a different kind of shop, less Victorian, more institutional, with climate-controlled cases and a waiting area that looked like a doctor's office. He'd been called ahead. He was ready for her. He spent 2 hours with the coins. He spent another hour with the gold pieces. Then he sat across from Renee at a table in his back office and told her what Harold Finn had told her, with more precision and more authority and more documentation, and the number he gave her was not $60,000 to $90,000. It was not even the same order of magnitude. Carl Bremer said that among the 6 St. Gaudens double eagles, there was one coin he needed her to understand specifically. He showed her the documentation he'd pulled during his evaluation. There was a variety from a particular mint year that had been produced in small quantities before the 1933 executive order stopped the presses, and of the coins produced that year in that facility, almost all had been melted down under the order. The ones that had survived were known. They were tracked. They appeared at major auction houses at intervals measured in years, and when they did, the results were reported in publications that covered such things. He explained that the coin's rarity was partly numerical, how few existed, and partly a function of its condition. Coins that had been hidden in walls, he said, and she caught the careful absence of irony in his voice, were sometimes in better condition than coins that had been handled over the same period of time, because darkness and stable temperature and the simple absence of human hands were kinder to gold than most things. The velvet in Leonard Marsh's box had deteriorated, but it had also cushioned. The plaster had kept the humidity low enough. The wall had done its job. He put a number on the paper in front of her. For that one coin, in the condition she'd brought him, based on the most recent comparable auction result. Renee looked at the number on the paper. She said, "I need a minute." Carl Bremer said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." He left the room. She heard him speaking quietly to someone in the front of the shop, the sound carrying without the words, the professional murmur of someone who gave difficult information to people regularly and knew how to give them space afterward. She sat in his back office in the city 2 hours from the house, where she'd woken up that morning and looked at the number that represented what one coin, from among 6 coins, from among everything in a hidden cavity in a wall built in 1941 by a man named Leonard Marsh, who had gotten the framing right, because he believed that if you got the framing right, everything else could be fixed. She looked at that number, and she thought about $4,380 assembled from every source available to her in a week of desperate calling. She thought about $912 in savings, and a lease ending in 6 weeks, and a landlord who'd said it almost kindly. She thought about Maren in the back seat with her cheek on the window glass, asleep. She thought about the pearl earrings. $230. The sick feeling and then the harder feeling that replaced it. The feeling she hadn't had a name for at the time, but that she now recognized as the particular resolution of a person who had decided that whatever she had to give, she would give, and whatever she had to sacrifice, she would. And she would not look away from what that cost her, because looking away was how you pretended the cost wasn't real. She thought about Gail saying, "Renee, what have you done?" She thought about sitting in her car at the end of a weedy driveway in the October light with the engine running, looking at a house with a sagging porch and boarded windows and a mailbox that had lost its flag, and feeling something she hadn't been able to articulate then and could barely articulate now, which was the certainty that this was hers. Not the legal certainty that came from signing papers, though that too, but something older than paperwork. The recognition you felt in your body, in the place that held the things you knew before you knew them. She thought about Dorothy Marsh writing in careful ink on plaster. "I hope this finds you in better times than we left." Not a wish for a specific person. A wish cast forward into the unknown, like planting something you wouldn't be alive to harvest. She picked up the paper. She looked at the number again. The number for the one coin was the kind of number that, when you'd spent your whole life operating in a register far below it, your brain received the way it received certain sounds, filtering it out at first as improbable before the meaning arrived. She looked at it long enough for the meaning to arrive. Then she picked up Carl Bremer's pen and she did the arithmetic for the whole collection, using the ranges he'd given her for the 5 remaining coins and the estimate for the gold pieces and the conservative melt value she'd calculated the night before, and she wrote a number at the bottom of the page. It was an estimate. It required auction confirmation, professional grading, a process that would take months and involve experts whose names she didn't know yet and paperwork she hadn't begun to imagine. It could shift in either direction by amounts that would matter. It was not a guarantee of anything. It was also, at its most conservative calculation, more money than her mother had earned in her entire working life. Carl Bremer came back to the room. He sat down across from her. He looked at the number she'd written at the bottom of the page and did not comment on it, which was its own kind of confirmation. She said, "What about the letters?" "The letters from Germany." He said he wasn't the right evaluator for those, but he knew who was. He said pre-war correspondence from Germany to the United States, particularly letters from the period between the wars and during the early years of the second one, had been the subject of significant historical archival interest in recent years. He said the value of such letters depended on content, condition, and the specific circumstances of the correspondence, and that she should have them evaluated separately by someone with the appropriate expertise before making any decisions about them. He said something else. He said that whatever she decided to do with everything she'd found, she should speak to a lawyer before she moved any further. Not because there was doubt about her ownership, which was established by the property deed she'd signed, but because the process of converting historical assets to realized wealth had steps and safeguards, and people who would want to help her navigate them, some of whom were genuinely helpful and some of whom were not, and that the difference mattered more than most people understood until it was too late. She thanked him. She packed the shoebox with the same care she'd unpacked it, each piece in its place, the flannel shirt tucked around the sides. She shook his hand. She walked out into the October afternoon with the shoebox under her arm and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the ordinary air of the city move around her. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A teenager sat on a bench nearby looking at his phone with the focused dissociation of someone who had temporarily evacuated his body to live inside a screen. The world was doing what it always did, which was to continue, indifferent and ordinary and necessary. Renee walked to her car. She placed the shoebox on the passenger seat. She sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Then she called Gail. Gail answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who'd been waiting. "How's Maren?" "Maren is fine. She's been telling Marcus about bugs for the past 2 hours. He is being very patient." "Renee?" "I know. Tell me what you found." Renee looked at the number she'd written at the bottom of Carl Bremer's paper, which she'd folded and put in her jacket pocket, and she thought about how to say it. She thought about what Gail would do with it, the immediate recalibration, the way her sister's practicality would absorb the information and turn it into questions and steps, and the concrete work of next things. She thought about how Gail had said, "I'll come help you clean it out," even when she thought it was a terrible idea, because that was who her sister was. She said, "I'll tell you everything when I get there. But I need you to know that it's good." Whatever I thought I was doing when I bought that house. Gail, it's good. The silence this time lasted only a moment. Then Gail said, okay, drive carefully. She drove south as the sun dropped toward the tree line, the shoebox on the seat beside her, Dorothy Marsh's letter photographed on her phone, the house waiting at the end of a gravel driveway that had mostly returned to weeds. She thought about the dresser and the grooves it had pressed into the floorboards over all those years, the evidence of weight and time, and something heavy kept in one place by someone who'd gotten the framing right. She thought about Maren asking, "Are we going to look?" She thought about her own answer. Yes. And what came after yes was what she still had to find out. The lawyer's name was Patricia Osei, and she had an office above a dry cleaner on the main commercial street of the county seat, a fact that Renee noted without judgment because she herself worked in a building whose lobby permanently smelled of the sandwich shop below it. Patricia had been 2 years ahead of Renee in high school, one of those people whose presence in a room always registered as competent without being loud about it. They hadn't been close then. They were the kind of near acquaintances who recognized each other at school events and nodded, two people whose paths ran parallel without touching. Renee had gotten Patricia's number from her own mother, who had gotten it from the woman at her church who said Patricia handled her nephew's estate and did it right, which was the highest endorsement her mother's community offered anything. Patricia listened to the whole story without interrupting. She sat across from Renee at a desk that was organized in the way of someone who processed a high volume of work and had no patience for losing things, papers and labeled folders, a second monitor angled for her eyes only, a notepad with writing so small Renee couldn't read it from across the desk. She had brought coffee from the place downstairs, and she held her mug in both hands and listened. When Renee finished, she said, "Let me make sure I have this correctly. You purchased the property at tax auction through the county lien office. You have the deed in your name. The property was listed, assessed, and transferred with no competing claims on record." Yes. And the items were found within the physical structure of the property, inside a sealed cavity in an interior wall, with written documentation from the original owner expressly conveying them to whoever occupied the house after her. Yes. Patricia wrote something on her notepad. She said, "The deed is the foundation. Anything affixed to or concealed within the physical structure of a property at the time of purchase transfers with the property, absent a specific prior claim." Dorothy Marsh's letter is not a legal instrument in the technical sense, but it establishes intent and provenance, which matters for the authentication process and which would matter significantly if anyone ever challenged your ownership of the items. She paused. Has anyone else seen the letter? The wall, the cavity, any of it? Maren. She's 3. Patricia's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Anyone else? No. I photographed everything before I moved it. I haven't told anyone except my sister, and I told her there was a find, not what it was specifically. Good. Keep it that way for now. Not forever. This will become known eventually, and the authentication and auction process involves people, but until we have everything properly documented and secured, discretion is your best protection. She leaned forward slightly. There are 3 things that need to happen before you do anything else. First, the items need to be professionally transported to a secure facility. Not your car, not your house. A proper vault. Second, you need to engage the authentication and appraisal process formally, which means engagement letters, written valuations, chain of custody documentation. Third, we need to establish your legal position in writing before anything goes to auction or sale, which I can handle on my end. She named what this would cost, which was less than Renee expected, and then said, the coin auction house fees and the appraiser fees will come out of proceeds, not your pocket. Standard practice for estate-level fines. Renee had written everything down on her own notepad, the habit of someone who worked in billing and understood that the difference between what was said and what was documented was often where problems lived. She said, there's also the letters. The German correspondence. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Pre-war? Based on the return address and the formation of the handwriting, yes. Possibly during the war as well. I don't know the content yet. I haven't opened them. Patricia set her mug down. She said, that's its own expertise. Historical documents, particularly correspondence from that period, involve a completely separate set of specialists and potentially a separate set of considerations. She didn't elaborate on what considerations meant, But something in the careful way she said it told Renee the letters were not a simple matter. I can give you a referral to a historian and an archivist who've worked with this type of material. She paused again. In the way she'd been pausing throughout the conversation, a deliberate rhythm that Renee had come to recognize as the space she gave complex information before she delivered it. Dorothy Marsh. Her maiden name. Do you know it? Renee thought about the letter. Dorothy had signed it Dorothy Marsh, and the A was the middle initial. She'd given her married name. I don't know her maiden name. The letter mentioned her mother. Letters from Germany. Patricia was writing again in her small, precise script. If her mother was German-born and corresponded from Germany until the war closed off that possibility, there may be a family history connected to those letters that matters for more reasons than monetary value. She looked up. I don't say this to complicate things for you. I say it because if those letters have historical significance, they may be wanted by archives or institutions in ways that produce their own kind of value, and you should understand that before any decisions are made. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Renee drove home with 3 referrals in her notes and a legal engagement letter signed and in her folder. She sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside, looking at the house through the windshield the way she had that first evening, the porch still sagging on its left side, the boards she'd replaced on the front steps still showing their newness against the weathered originals. The house looked the same. She looked the same. The morning felt ordinary in the way that mornings after extraordinary things sometimes chose to behave, as though the world needed a day to absorb what had happened before it let you feel the full shape of it. Gail arrived an hour later with Maren and a container of soup and the expression of someone who had been exercising restraint for 18 hours and was approaching its limit. She sat at the kitchen table while Renee told her everything. Not the numbers, not yet, but the sequence of it. The wall, the letter, Dorothy Marsh's handwriting, the cavity, the coins, the drive north, Carl Bremer's office, and the number on the paper. Gail sat with her hands flat on the table and listened without speaking, which was unusual enough that Maren looked at her aunt twice to check she was still functioning normally. When Renee finished, Gail said, "Show me the wall." They stood in the bedroom together, Maren between them. The dresser pushed further aside now to reveal the full section of writing. Gail read it slowly. Renee watched her sister's face move through the stages she recognized from her own reading the initial register of information, the shift when the content went deeper than expected, the moment somewhere in the middle when it became personal rather than just interesting. Gail had always been the practical one. That was the family shorthand, the way you described people when you needed to give them a fixed point in the family map. Gail was practical, Renee was stubborn, their mother was warm and indecisive in equal measure. The practical one and the stubborn one, their mother used to say, like I was trying to cover all the bases. Gail managed properties. She understood what buildings cost, and what they returned, and what they bled out of you when they needed more than you had. She had come to this house 3 weeks ago fully expecting it to confirm everything she knew about the math of neglected structures, and it had confirmed a great deal of it, and she'd helped anyway because that was also who she was, the label notwithstanding. Now Gail stood reading a dead woman's handwriting on a wall in a house her sister had bought with borrowed money and the kind of faith that had no actuarial basis, and Renee watched the practical one absorb something that could not be reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. When Gail reached the end, she stood for a moment without speaking. Then she said, she trusted a stranger. She trusted whoever needed it. Gail looked at the baseboard, the trim piece Renee had replaced after her visit to Harold Finn. Is it all still in there? No. It's in a secure facility. I moved it yesterday, with the transport service Patricia recommended. You've already talked to a lawyer. First thing. Gail turned to look at her. Her expression had something in it Renee didn't often see in her sister's face, which was the specific softening that came when Gail was impressed without wanting to fully admit it. She said, how much? Renee told her the conservative estimate, the low end of the range, because she had learned that the low end was the number that couldn't hurt you when things went differently than projected. Gail sat down on the bedroom floor. Maren immediately sat down beside her. Auntie Gail? I'm fine, baby. I'm just sitting. It's what you do, Maren agreed. Mommy sat here too. The authentication process took 11 weeks. Life did not pause for it. Life was constitutionally opposed to pausing. Maren needed her lunches packed and her hair brushed and her picture books read at bedtime in the specific order she'd established, which was inflexible and non-negotiable and changed without notice. The medical billing office needed Renee at her desk at 8:30 each morning, processing claims that came in a volume that did not care what had been found in a wall in her house the previous week. The house itself needed the daily work of being lived in the ordinary maintenance of a structure that was still learning how to function again after years of abandonment. She worked on the house on weekends and evenings with a different quality of attention now, not the desperate focus of survival, but something quieter and more patient. She repaired the kitchen cabinet doors, raying the ones that had come loose and replacing the two that were beyond saving with reclaimed panels she found at the architectural salvage yard 20 miles away. She refinished the kitchen table she'd found in the basement, the one she'd first thought was ruined by water damage until she sanded through the surface layer and found intact wood underneath, grain that caught the light in a particular way, warm brown with a thread of gold in it. She worked in the evenings after Maren was in bed, the orbital sander loud enough that she worried about waking her, and then graduated to hand sanding in the last stages, the wood smooth under her palm. She was learning that houses had layers. Not in a metaphorical sense, though that was also true, but literally, physically successive generations of people making their decisions on top of the previous decisions, wallpaper over plaster over lath, paint over the original finish, each layer a record of who had been here and what they'd valued and how much care they'd had to give. You could sand through the layers of a table and find what was original underneath, if you were patient enough, and if the original had been built well enough to survive. Renee learned more about coins in those 11 weeks than she had known existed to learn. She learned the language of the profession obverse and reverse, strike quality, luster, bag marks, the scale from poor, 1 to mint state, 70 that determined condition and therefore a substantial portion of value. She learned that the St. Gaudens double eagles she'd found were assessed by a third-party grading service housed in a facility with more security than the bank where she kept her savings account, that the coins were sealed in tamper-evident holders with certification numbers that could be verified online, that the whole process was designed to remove the human element from valuation because the human element was where most of the arguments lived. She learned that the particular coin Carl Bremer had flagged was exactly what he'd suggested it might be. The grading service confirmed it. The auction house confirmed it. The specialist who handled the written assessment confirmed it in language she read 3 times before calling Patricia to ask if she was reading it correctly. Yes, Patricia said. You're reading it correctly. She learned that the gold pieces from the canvas pouch were not merely raw gold, but specifically traceable material that a geologist consultant identified as consistent with a particular mining region in the American West, a region that had been productive in the early part of the 20th century and whose output sometimes entered private hands through channels that bypassed commercial minting. This mattered for collectors in ways that added a premium to straightforward melt value. It also told a story about Leonard Marsh, about how he had come to have what he had, the choices he'd made about where to put it, the faith he'd placed in his own walls over the systems of his time. She learned these things methodically, in weekly phone calls with Patricia and bi-weekly visits to the city where the coins were being processed, and she kept Maren in the loop in the way you kept a 3-year-old in the loop, which was to tell her the true version in simplified form, without creating either anxiety or expectations that a child shouldn't have to carry. We found something important in the wall. Some people are looking at it carefully to understand how important. Are the shiny ones valuable? Very possibly. Like treasure? Like treasure. Maren absorbed this and returned to her bug picture book and did not raise the subject again for 2 weeks, at which point she asked whether the treasure had belonged to the lady who wrote on the wall, and Renee said yes, and Maren said, and now it's ours because she wanted it to be, and Renee said yes, and Maren said, that was nice of her, and went back to the bugs. The letters were a different story. The archivist Patricia had referred her to was a woman named Dr. Annika Voss, who worked at a university 40 miles away and had spent most of her career studying the documentary record of the Jewish diaspora from Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s. She came to the secure facility to examine the letters in person, wearing cotton gloves and carrying a magnifying loupe and a camera with a macro lens, and she sat at the examination table for 3 hours while Renee waited in the adjoining room. Renee had brought a book. She read 12 pages of it and could not have told you what any of them said. She thought about the letters. She had not opened them herself. She had looked at the envelopes, had noted the handwriting that was European in its formation, had recognized the return address as a German city without knowing more about it specifically. She had been reluctant to open them for a reason she didn't fully understand at the time, only that they felt like something that deserved the right hands and the right context before they were touched, the way certain things did. The coins were objects, valuable and historical, but objects, things you could hold and appraise and understand through the language of markets and rarity. The letters were something else. They were voices. She thought about Dorothy Marsh keeping them for 50 years, from whenever she'd last received the final one in 1941 until 1974 when she packed her life and left. Keeping them and then choosing to leave them, sealed and protected, in the wall of the house she was giving to whoever came next. That was a specific decision. You did not keep letters for 50 years by accident. You kept them because they were the closest thing you had to a person who was gone, and you left them in a wall because when you were 80 years old and moving to Phoenix to be near your daughter, you made certain reckonings about what you could carry and what had to stay. When Dr. Voss came out, her face was composed, but her hands were moving in the particular way of someone processing something that had moved them. She sat down across from Renee and folded her hands on the table. She said, "The letters span from 1933 to 1941. There are 23 of them. They are correspondence from a woman named Hilda Kaufman to her daughter Ruth, who was Dorothy Marsh's mother." She paused. Hilda was Dorothy's maternal grandmother. The letters document Hilda's decision not to emigrate when her daughter Ruth left Germany in 1932, her subsequent years living in Frankfurt, her experiences as the political situation changed, her reports of what she witnessed, and what happened to people she knew. The last letter is dated October 1941. Renee understood what that meant. She had read enough, over the years, to understand what October 1941 meant in the context of a Jewish woman in Frankfurt who had stayed. Dr. Voss confirmed it without naming it directly. The correspondence stops after that date. The content of the final letter suggests Hilda understood what was coming and wrote with that understanding. She said this carefully, with the precision of someone who had spent a career handling the documentary weight of that period and had learned that careful language was not evasion, but respect. Renee felt the weight of it settle across the room. 23 letters. A woman writing to her daughter in America, while the world she'd lived in was dismantled around her, choosing to stay because she was too old or too proud or too rooted to the specific soil of the place where she'd been born to leave it for a country whose language she didn't speak. Writing anyway, saying what needed to be said with the knowledge that it might travel through walls and years and arrive in the hands of strangers. She placed a folder on the table. "I've made photographs of each letter with the facility's permission. I would like to ask you something about your intentions before I say anything else." "Go ahead." "These letters are historically significant in a way that is separate from their monetary value. They are primary source documents. They name individuals, locations, circumstances that are either unknown or fragmentary in the existing archival record. There are institutions, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, that would consider them of considerable importance." She met Renee's eyes. "I want to be honest with you about the monetary dimension. A complete collection of this kind, authenticated, in this condition, would attract serious interest from private collectors as well as institutions. The institutional route typically means donation or loan, which has tax implications but not direct payment. The private collector route means sale, which has different implications." She paused again. "You are under no obligation to choose the institutional route. They are your property. I want to be honest because I believe you should make the decision with full information, and I also believe you are someone who would want to know all of what these letters are before deciding." Renee looked at the folder of photographs on the table. She thought about Hilda Kaufman in Frankfurt in October 1941, writing a letter to her daughter in America and understanding it might be the last one. Writing it anyway, saying what needed to be said with the knowledge that it might travel through walls and years and arrive in the hands of strangers. She thought about Dorothy Marsh writing behind a dresser. "I hope this finds you in better times than we left." She said, "What would the museum do with them?" Dr. Voss said, "Preserve them permanently. Digitize them, translate them, make them part of the accessible record. They would be credited to Dorothy Marsh's family and to you as the finder and donor." People doing research, historians, family members looking for ancestors, educators, would be able to access them. She looked at Renee steadily. They would be remembered. Hilda Kaufman would be remembered specifically by name, in a way that the archival record cannot currently do. Renee was quiet for a moment. She said, "Tell me about the tax implications." Patricia walked her through it in their next call. A donation of historically significant documents to a qualifying institution was a charitable deduction at appraised fair market value. Dr. Voss had estimated the collection's value for private sale. The deduction would be calculated against that figure. Given Renee's income bracket and the proceeds she was about to receive from the coin auction, the deduction was not insignificant. Patricia said it carefully, framing it as information rather than recommendation, because she was constitutionally opposed to steering clients. But the information was clear. Renee said, "I want to donate them." Patricia said, "I'll draw up the paperwork." She said, "I want one thing. I want a copy of all of them, translated into English, for Maren, when she's old enough to understand them. I want her to know who they came from and what they said." Patricia was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when something landed differently than she expected. Then she said, "I'll make sure that's included in the transfer agreement." The coin auction was scheduled for late spring at a house in New York that handled major estate sales. Renee drove up the day before with Patricia and spent the evening in a hotel room that cost more per night than she spent on groceries in a week, trying to read a novel and failing because her mind kept walking the path between where she was and where she'd been 6 months earlier. She called Gail from the hotel bed. Gail said, "How do you feel?" "Strange. Like it isn't real, and also like it's the realest thing that's ever happened. Both of those can be true at the same time." "I know." Gail was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "The earrings. Mom's pearl earrings." Renee had forgotten she'd told Gail about those. $230 on a resale app. The sick feeling, then the harder feeling. She said, "Yeah, we're going to get them back. The resale listing is probably gone by now, Gail. Then we'll find the person who bought them and buy them back at whatever they want for them." Gail's voice had the tone she used when a decision had already been made, and she was simply informing the world of it. "Those earrings belong to Grandma, and they belong in the family, and that's the end of it." Renee lay on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something move through her that was not one feeling but several at once, pressed together so tightly they were indistinguishable from each other. Gratitude and grief and the particular exhaustion of having been afraid for a long time and feeling the fear begin, slowly, to loosen. She said, "Gail, I know. I mean it. Thank you. I came and helped you clean a condemned building, Renee. Don't make it into something sentimental. It's not condemned." She could hear her sister smiling through the phone. "Go to sleep. Big day tomorrow." She did not go to sleep for another 2 hours, but when she did, she slept without waking until 6 in the morning, which was unusual enough that she lay still for a moment, aware of the quiet, before getting up. The auction room was smaller than she'd expected and more businesslike. Rows of chairs facing a podium, phones on a bank of tables along one wall, where remote bidders were managed by staff who wore headsets and spoke in low, continuous voices. The coins were displayed in a case at the front, each in its certified holder, the certificates facing outward so the room could see the grading. Patricia sat beside her. Renee wore the blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop the week before, which was the nicest thing she owned and which fit well enough that she'd stopped worrying about it by the time they arrived. She had spoken to no one in the room except Patricia. She was not there to be known. She was not ready yet to be the person this story made her, which she could feel taking shape around her in the weeks since the auction house had listed the coins and the specialist publications had carried the notice. Her name was on the consignment documents. The auction house did not release consignor identities, but there were people in this room who knew how to trace things, and she understood that the period of pure privacy she'd maintained since October was drawing to a close. She was not sure how she felt about that. She had spent most of her adult life being someone whose story was not particularly remarkable, and the unremarkable quality of it had been both a burden and a protection, the way plainness could be. You did not attract the wrong attention. You managed your own life in the space that ordinariness provided. She had learned to find satisfaction in small things, in Maren's face, in the refinished grain of the kitchen table, in the particular color of the November light through the east-facing window, and that learning had not been nothing. It had been, in fact, the whole architecture of who she was. She was not sure a remarkable story would improve any of that. But she was here, in this room, and the coins were in that case, and some portion of what happened next was already decided. The auctioneer moved through the lots with professional efficiency. When the St. Gaudens collection was announced, Renee felt Patricia's hand on her arm, a brief light pressure, the kind of contact that meant pay attention without meaning to suggest she hadn't been. The bidding on the 5 standard coins moved quickly, the hammer falling on numbers that individually were more than Renee had made in any single year of her working life. She kept her face steady. Patricia had coached her, do not react visibly, not to high numbers and not to low numbers, because the room was watching and the auction process had its own rhythm that emotion could disrupt. Then the auctioneer announced the key coin. He named its date and facility and grade, and cited the comparable auction result that Carl Bremer had shown her in his back office 5 months earlier. The room had a particular quality of attention, the specific quiet of people who knew what they were looking at. The bidding opened. It moved faster than the others, and then slowed as the number climbed past the comparable result, into territory that the auctioneer acknowledged with a single understated phrase. We are in record territory for this piece before the hammer came down on a number that Renee would remember precisely for the rest of her life. The way people remembered the exact figure of things that changed the geometry of everything. Patricia wrote it on her notepad and turned it so Renee could see. Renee looked at it. She thought about Dorothy Marsh writing, I believe in walls built with intention. After the auction, they went to a restaurant 2 blocks from the auction house. Just the two of them, a place Patricia had chosen, and they sat in a booth and ordered food that Renee barely tasted because the afternoon was still moving through her in waves. Patricia ordered wine, which she rarely did, and poured a glass for each of them and raised hers without saying anything ceremonial, just a small lift that meant something without needing to name it. Renee raised her glass back. Patricia said, You handled that very well. I didn't do anything. I sat in a chair. You sat in a chair in a room where a great deal of money was changing hands, and you didn't cry or faint or say anything you would have regretted. That counts as handling it well, in my experience. Renee thought about the things she'd felt when the hammer came down. Not joy exactly, or not only joy. Something more complex, with grief in it, and the particular feeling of a long tension releasing. She thought about the $4,380 she'd assembled from 9 sources, and the pearl earrings she'd sold, and the 6 weeks she'd had before her lease ended. She thought about Maren asleep in the back seat of the car looking at a house with a collapsed porch. She thought about Leonard Marsh in 1941 getting the framing right, because he believed that if you got it right, everything else could be fixed, and putting that philosophy into walls that had held through 8 decades and 2 floods and several tenants who hadn't cared, and 1 county government that had stopped caring, and 1 woman who arrived with borrowed money, and a 3-year-old, and the kind of stubbornness that her sister called by its name and her mother called by a different one. She said, I want to find Dorothy Marsh's family. Patricia looked at her over her glass. Carol, the daughter in Phoenix. She'd be in her 80s now. She may not be living, but she may have children or grandchildren. Dorothy left everything to me because she didn't have anyone or couldn't find anyone, but that may have changed. I want to try to find them. Patricia set her glass down. You're not legally obligated to, I know. I want to try anyway. Patricia looked at her for a moment with the expression she sometimes used, carefully professional on the surface, but underneath it something that was actual feeling rather than its approximation. She said, I'll look into it. The gold pieces sold the following week through a specialist dealer Patricia had identified, the price reflecting both melt value and the collector premium for the documented provenance. The total, combined with the auction results and less the fees that came out of proceeds as Patricia had promised, resolved to a number that Renee wrote down in her own handwriting and looked at for a long time in the kitchen of the house at 14 Aldercroft Road, sitting at the table she'd found in the basement and sanded and refinished herself in November, Maren asleep upstairs. She paid back every person she'd borrowed from to make the $4,200. She paid Gail first, then her mother, then Patricia who had fronted the transport costs, then the credit union, all of it with interest she calculated herself and added without being asked because the interest was not the point. The point was that she had borrowed against trust, and the trust deserved the full accounting. She paid for the pearl earrings. Gail had tracked the resale listing to a woman in the next county who had bought them for her daughter's wedding and who agreed, with some negotiation and considerable goodwill, to sell them back at 3 times what Gail offered to start. Renee paid it without discussion. The earrings came back in a small envelope in the mail, and she put them in the drawer of her bedside table and cried for about 10 minutes, which felt like the right amount of time. She paid the property taxes on the house, a full year in advance. She paid to have the porch rebuilt properly, a structural repair she'd been putting off since October because it was beyond what Robert's tutorials had prepared her for, and she hired a local contractor named Dave who did the work in 3 days and said, "This house was built solid." And Renee said, yes, she knew. She did not tell people what she'd found. Not specifically, not in the way that would have made the story travel. Patricia had advised discretion and Renee had her own reasons for it, which had to do partly with privacy and partly with something harder to name. The experience felt like something that belonged to her and to Dorothy Marsh, and to the long thread of intention running from 1941 through all the years between, and she was not ready to hand it to the world's appetite for remarkable stories. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Her co-worker Denise noticed something was different in the way that co-workers did, through the accumulation of small signals that didn't individually mean anything, but in combination pointed at something. She noticed that Renee had stopped eating lunch at her desk and started going out for an hour, which she'd never done before. She noticed that Renee had stopped checking her phone during meetings with the particular frequency of someone monitoring an account balance. She noticed that when the conversation turned to the subject of Renee's house, as it did every few weeks because Denise was genuinely interested, Renee's responses were settled rather than anxious in a way that was new. She said finally, one day by the coffee machine, "Something happened with your house." Renee poured her coffee. "Something happened with my house. Good something or bad something?" "Good something." Denise studied her. "You're not going to tell me?" "Not right now." Denise nodded with the equanimity of someone who understood that people had a right to their own timing. She said, "Whenever you're ready. I want to hear it." Renee had told her mother on a Sunday afternoon, driving out to the house where she'd grown up to have the conversation in person rather than over the phone. Her mother was in her late 50s, retired from her job at the school district's administrative office, and lived in the house she and Renee's father had bought when Renee was 4, a house that had also needed work and had been worked on over 3 decades into something that felt permanent and intentional. Her mother had understood houses in the way of someone who had put herself into one over a long time. She sat at her kitchen table and listened to Renee's account with the stillness of someone who was listening with everything, not just her ears. And when Renee reached the end and told her the number, her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dorothy Marsh. Yes, your grandmother used to say that houses chose their people." Renee hadn't heard that. She looked at her mother. "She said it about this house, when we bought it, that we hadn't found the house had found us. I always thought it was a nice thing people said." Her mother was looking at the table, at her hands resting on the wood of the same surface where she'd served 3 decades of meals and done a decade of school paperwork, and sat with 2 daughters through the ordinary weight of ordinary years. But maybe she meant it literally. Maybe some houses have something they're holding, and they hold it until the right person walks in. Renee thought about the grooves in the floorboards, about how long it took for something heavy to leave a mark like that. But the house at 14, Aldercroft Road began, without announcement, to look like what it had always been underneath the neglect. The porch was straight and solid. The windows were glazed and sealed. The paint was a color Renee and Maren had chosen together on a Saturday morning at the hardware store. Maren holding up swatches with the seriousness of a person who understood that the decision mattered, settling finally on a pale green that was almost gray in certain lights and almost the color of new leaves in others. It was the right color for the house. They both knew it the moment they saw it on the sample board. She had the root cellar cleared out in February. She was not yet ready to deal with what Dorothy had described as the false panel on the east wall that felt like a separate undertaking, something that required its own moment of readiness, but she had the rest of the cellar cleaned, the standing water addressed, the stone walls pointed where the mortar had crumbled. It was dry and cool and useful, exactly what a root cellar was supposed to be. One afternoon in late March, she moved the dresser. She'd been thinking about doing it for weeks, waiting for a day when the thought felt right rather than effortful, and this particular Tuesday it felt right. She moved it to the far wall of the bedroom, where it turned out to fit perfectly, the proportions working in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The exposed wall where Dorothy had written was clean plaster. The ink faded but still legible, and Renee decided she would not paint over it. She would not frame it or do anything that would make it a display rather than what it was. She would simply leave it on the wall where it had always been, for as long as she lived in this house, so that it could be read by whoever needed to read it. She stood in front of it and read it again herself. "I hope this finds you in better times than we left." It had. It had found her in better times than she'd left. Not the better times that meant easy or comfortable or free of difficulty, but the better times that meant she knew where Maren was sleeping, and she knew the house was hers, and she knew that the porch would hold weight and the windows would keep out the cold, and the walls had been built by someone who got the framing right. She looked at the line about the November sunrise through the east-facing kitchen window. She had seen it twice already, the first time in November, 3 weeks after they moved in, when she'd been in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning making coffee, and the light had come in at an angle she hadn't expected and filled the whole room with something orange and warm and so particular to that moment and that window and that hour that she'd stood without moving until it passed. The second time she'd brought Maren downstairs early and they'd sat at the table with mugs, Maren's with hot chocolate, and watched it happen together. She'd thought about Dorothy both times. She thought about her now. She said, "I got the framing right." The house was quiet around her. The way old houses were quiet, not empty, but full of the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in them, the specific silence of walls that it held. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the corner of the garden and sat there for a moment in its astonishing redness against the gray March light, and then flew. There was still the matter of the east wall of the root cellar, the false panel Dorothy had mentioned. The press the lower left corner instruction she'd given as an afterthought, almost practical, almost as if she were leaving notes for a contractor, not because of what is behind it now, she'd written, but because you should know it is there. Renee had not yet gone to look. She'd been holding it in reserve the way you held certain things in reserve, not from fear exactly, but from the understanding that some moments deserve their own day. Dorothy had written that it currently held woodworking tools and jarred preserves. She'd written that in 1974, 50 years of jarred preserves in a sealed cellar panel would not be the same jarred preserves they'd been when she sealed them, which was its own kind of accounting. But she'd also written, but because you should know it is there, and the emphasis on know suggested the knowing mattered beyond the contents. She was honest with herself, wanted to approach it right. She had gone to the wall cavity in the bedroom propelled by the momentum of Maren's discovery, by the immediate logic of a letter that told her something was there. She had not had time to prepare herself. The preparation had happened after, in retrograde, catching up with what had already occurred. This time she wanted to come to the door from the other direction, knowing what she was doing and why, choosing the moment. She decided she would go in April. She was also, in April, waiting to hear back from Patricia about Dorothy's daughter Carol. Patricia had found a death record for a Carol Marsh Hendricks of Phoenix, Arizona, deceased 2019. She had found a surviving son, Dorothy's grandson, named Paul Hendricks, who lived in Tucson. Patricia had sent a carefully worded letter to his last known address, and they were waiting to see whether it would reach him and whether he would respond and what he would say if he did. Renee had thought carefully about what she wanted from this, which was not a simple thing to identify. She did not owe the Hendricks family anything in a legal sense. Dorothy had been explicit. Without condition, she'd written, and Patricia had been clear that the legal basis was unambiguous. But something in her needed the circle to be more complete than it was. Dorothy had left a gift for a stranger in a wall, and the stranger had found it and been changed by it, and was now living in the house where the gift had waited, sleeping in the rooms where Dorothy had raised her children, watching the November sunrise through the east-facing kitchen window. That felt like a relationship, even at the distance of 50 years and death, and relationships deserved acknowledgement. She wanted Paul Hendricks to know his grandmother had been kept, that her handwriting was still on the wall of the house she'd loved, and that it would stay there, that someone was living in it who understood what it had been built to hold. She thought that was what she wanted to say. She wasn't sure yet how to say it. She was waiting for the right words the same way she'd waited for the right day to open the cellar door, with the understanding that rushing certain things cost you the thing itself. Renee decided she would go to the east wall of the root cellar on a Thursday in early April, when the ground was thawed and the light was good and Maren was at school, and she had a whole morning to give to whatever she found. She decided she would bring her phone to document it, and a flashlight and the calm she'd been practicing for 6 months, the kind that came not from certainty, but from having learned that the house rewarded patience over haste. She had gotten the framing right. Everything else, as Leonard Marsh had promised, could be fixed. Dorothy's handwriting sat on the plaster in its faded amber ink, unhurried and particular, the way the handwriting of people who wrote with intention always looked. Patient. Waiting. A voice from 50 years ago that had traveled through the particular silence of walls and arrived, finally, at someone who needed to hear it. She thought about Maren, who would read this wall someday with adult eyes, who would read the translations of Hilda Kaufman's letters when she was old enough for them, who would grow up in a house that contained, literally in its walls, the record of people who had believed the future was worth writing to. She thought about what that would mean to her daughter in ways she could not entirely predict, because children absorb things differently than their mothers planned and grew into understandings that exceeded what they'd been given. She thought Maren would be okay. She had thought so since the second week in the house, when she'd watched her daughter sit on the cracked kitchen floor with a stick she'd found in the yard and draw elaborate maps of the property, labeling the areas she'd claimed for different purposes: bug territory, flower corner, the mysterious zone near the barn designated for future investigation. The confidence in that, the assumption that the world had space in it for her plans, was something Renee had worked at giving her daughter from the beginning and had managed imperfectly, the way you managed anything you cared about very much. But it was there. It had roots. The house was teaching Maren something Renee could not have anticipated when she'd sat in her car at the end of a weedy driveway in October light and felt the recognition she had no clean word for. It was teaching her that things left with care had a way of arriving where they were needed, that walls built with intention held, that some gifts came through time and strangers and the particular faith of people who wrote letters to futures they couldn't see. Renee left the room. The door stood open behind her, the way doors in this house mostly stood open now, the rooms no longer needing to be kept separate from each other, the whole house breathing as a single space that was theirs. Downstairs, the kitchen table waited with its refinished grain catching the afternoon light, and the east-facing window held the pale spring sky above the garden where April was already making its argument for return. In 2 days, she would go down to the root cellar. She would press the lower left corner of the east wall and see what Dorothy had left there in 1974 along with her tools and her sentimentality and her faith in whoever came after. She was ready for it now. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the corner of the yard and sat there for a moment in its astonishing redness against the pale spring light, and then flew. The Thursday she chose was the kind of April morning that arrived already decided, the sky a clean, unambiguous blue, and the air carrying that particular cool that wouldn't last past 10 o'clock, the temperature that made you want to be outside doing something physical before the warmth came and softened everything. Renee dropped Maren at school at 8:15, stood at the car for a moment watching her daughter walk through the entrance doors without looking back, which was something new, the not looking back, the assumption that the world ahead was safe enough to enter without checking that her mother was still there. She'd started doing it 3 weeks ago. Renee had noticed it the first time and felt the bittersweet specific to parents, the pride and the mild ache of being needed slightly less. She drove home on the empty back roads with the window down. The house was quiet when she let herself in, the way it was quiet on mornings when Maren was at school and Renee had the rooms to herself, a different quality of silence than the night silence, more provisional, like a held breath. She made coffee and stood at the east-facing kitchen window and watched the garden for a few minutes. The beds she and Maren had turned in March were showing the first green of things coming up, a thin fuzz of seedlings along the rows where they'd planted the earliest vegetables. The wild corner at the fence line was already moving, the perennials that had survived the property's years of abandonment pushing back up through the ground the way they did every spring, unbothered by neglect, operating on their own long schedule. She finished her coffee. She got the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, her phone from the counter, and a small pry bar she'd taken to keeping in the mudroom because there were still things in this house that needed gentle persuasion. She put on the work boots she wore for cellar tasks, the laces double-knotted against the uneven stone floor. She opened the door at the back of the kitchen that led to the cellar stairs. The cellar had a different quality now than it had when they'd first arrived. Then it had been a flooded, dripping space she'd looked at once and closed off, something to be dealt with after the more urgent problems above it. The work in February had changed it. The floor was dry. The stone walls were pointed. She'd installed 2 bare bulbs on a run of cable that gave the space enough light to work in, supplemented now by the morning light that came in through the single small window on the north side. It smelled of old stone and the particular mineral cleanness of a space that had been dry for long enough. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the east wall. It looked exactly like the other walls. That was the point Dorothy had written, that the panel was invisible, set flush, the seam disappearing into the surrounding stonework. Renee walked the length of the wall slowly, running her fingertips along the surface in the same way she'd found the latch in the bedroom wall cavity, by feel rather than sight. The stone here was the same gray field stone as the rest of the cellar, mortared in the irregular courses of something built by someone working with what the land provided rather than with uniform materials from a supplier. She found the seam about 2/3 of the way down the wall's length. It was barely there, a line marginally finer than the mortar joints around it, running vertically for about 4 feet, and then turning to run along the floor. She crouched down and pressed the lower left corner. Nothing moved immediately. She pressed harder, at the point where the wall met the floor, and felt the same give she'd felt in the bedroom baseboard, the compression of something designed to yield. She held the pressure for 3 seconds and heard a soft sound, not a click exactly, more like the release of tension in something long held closed, and a section of the wall swung inward 6 inches and stopped. The space behind it was dark. She held her flashlight through the opening and looked. The first things she saw were what Dorothy had described: a woodworking bench along the near wall, tools on hooks above it, their wooden handles gray with age and dust. Below the bench, a row of mason jars, 24 at least, their contents gone to the indeterminate brown of things preserved beyond their useful life, the lids domed with the slight convex curve of seals that had held for 50 years. The bench itself was massive, hand-built from the same kind of oak as the dresser upstairs, and it occupied most of the near wall with the proprietary permanence of something that had been here from the beginning. On the bench's surface, set carefully apart from the tools, was a wooden box she had not expected. She pushed the door fully open. It swung wide on hinges that moved smoothly, which told her Leonard had oiled them when he built this, had maintained them, had cared for this space the way he cared for everything he built. She stepped inside. The room was roughly 8 feet by 10, low-ceilinged, the joists of the floor above visible overhead. Dry, as the rest of the cellar was dry now, and in the particular way of a sealed space, the air had an oldness to it, decades of stillness that shifted when the door opened like something exhaling. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She went to the wooden box first. It was not elaborate. Roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep, made from the same oak as the bench. The lid fitted rather than hinged so that it lifted straight off. No clasp, no lock. Someone had trusted the sealed room to be security enough. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white and was now the ivory of long-stored fabric, was a set of folded papers. She lifted them carefully, the cloth falling away to reveal several layers. The outermost paper was a folded sheet of the same cream-colored stationery that Dorothy had used for her wall letter, the same precise handwriting across the surface. She almost set it aside to read later, almost made herself wait, and then didn't, because she had learned over the past months that the things in this house arrived when they were ready, and that her job was to receive them, not to manage their timing. She unfolded the letter and read, standing up in the cellar's dim light, with her flashlight in her other hand. This one was shorter than the bedroom wall letter. It had been written in a different year, the date at the top reading March 1968, 6 years before the longer letter. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different, less valedictory, more immediate. Dorothy had written this not as a farewell, but as a record. It began, "Leonard passed this morning. I am not ready to write about that yet. But I am writing this because he asked me to, this week when he still could, and I am doing it the way he asked, which was to put it here where he put everything that mattered. Leonard built this room in 1943. He told me it was for the invasion, which I believed at the time and which I understand now was partly true and partly not. He did believe there might be an invasion. He also built this room because he had something to put in it that he did not know what to do with, and that he needed to keep safe, and that he needed to explain in a way that might not be believed. In 1941, before Leonard built this house, he spent 2 years working in Nevada, mining. He was part of a small private operation that was neither legal nor entirely illegal, the kind of arrangement that was common enough in that period that people did it without understanding the full weight of what they were taking from the ground. He came home with what he came home with, and he put it into the walls of the house he built, and he understood that it could not be openly claimed because of how he'd come to have it. The coins I put in the bedroom wall are the ones Leonard bought through an ordinary process from a coin dealer in Pittsburgh in 1931 and 1932, before the executive order. He always said that was the legitimate holding and that everything else was something he'd have to account for eventually, and that the eventual accounting was what he intended this room to hold. Behind the workbench, in the floor of this room, there is a stone that is not mortared in like the others. Leonard set it loose deliberately. Under it is a metal box. In the box is what Leonard brought home from Nevada and never knew how to claim, and could never bring himself to discard, and finally decided to leave for whoever came after with the instruction that they should understand what it was before they decided what to do with it. He said, "Tell them it is theirs. Tell them the weight of it is theirs too. Tell them I am sorry I could not resolve it myself. I am telling you now." Renee stood in the low-ceilinged room with the letter in her hand, and felt the particular sensation of a story revealing another layer beneath the one she'd thought was the bottom. She had found the coins. She had found the gold pieces. She had thought she understood the shape of what Leonard Marsh had hidden in his walls and why. She had spent 6 months learning that shape, living with it, building a new life on top of it. There was another layer. She moved to the workbench and looked behind it. The bench was pushed against the wall, but not flush to it. A gap of about 8 inches between the bench's back rail and the stone. She angled her flashlight into that gap and looked at the floor. The stones of the cellar floor were set in mortar, the same field stone as the walls, fitted together with the careful attention of someone who understood that a floor was a foundation and a foundation needed to be right. All of them except one, approximately 2 feet from the east wall and centered behind the bench. That one sat slightly higher than its neighbors, its edges not filled with mortar, but bordered by a thin line of settled dust that showed it had been set in place and removed and replaced, not once, but many times. She moved the workbench by degrees, the heavy oak sliding on the stone floor with a sound like reluctance, until she had enough room to kneel beside the loose stone. She worked her fingers into the gap at its edge and lifted. It came up cleanly, the way a thing came up when it had been designed to be lifted. The stone was perhaps 18 inches square and 3 inches thick, heavier than it looked, and she set it aside on the floor and pointed her flashlight into the space beneath. A metal box sat in a cavity cut into the earth below the floor level. The box was larger than the one on the workbench, roughly the size of a small suitcase, made from what appeared to be galvanized steel, its surface marked with the rust patterns of long storage in variable humidity. A hasp and padlock on the front, the lock itself old, a large-barreled model of the kind that had been common in the early 20th century. Renee sat on the floor beside it. She was alone in a sealed room in the cellar of a house that had been hers for 7 months, and she had just found something that the letter on the workbench suggested was different in kind from the coins in the bedroom wall. The coins had been a straightforward inheritance, legally and morally clean, Dorothy's explicit gift. This was something Leonard had described as having weight of a different sort. She thought about what she knew. She thought about the phrase neither legal nor entirely illegal and understood that this was the language of a man softening something he wasn't proud of for the woman he'd spent his life with. She thought about Nevada in 1941 and private mining operations and what it meant to come home with something you couldn't openly claim. She did not open the box in the cellar. She photographed it, the cavity, the loose stone, the workbench, all of it in sequence, documenting the location and condition the same way she'd documented everything else in this house since the beginning. She lifted the box from its cavity. It was heavier than she expected, substantially heavier, the weight shifting as she moved it, and carried it up the cellar stairs to the kitchen table. Then she called Patricia. Patricia arrived at the house that afternoon, which was not what Renee had expected when she left the voicemail. She'd expected a call back, a conversation, guidance delivered through a phone speaker while she stood in the kitchen. Instead, Patricia drove 40 minutes to the county and sat across from her at the refinished kitchen table with the metal box between them and the copy of Dorothy's cellar letter beside it. Patricia read the letter twice. She looked at the box. She looked at Renee. She said, "You haven't opened it." "No." "Good. Let's talk before you do." They talked for an hour. Patricia laid out the legal landscape with the calm efficiency Renee had come to rely on, the same measured delivery she used for everything, which was one of the reasons she was good at her job. The picture she painted was more complex than the bedroom wall discovery had been, which had been clean and documented and legally unambiguous from the beginning. This was different because Dorothy had told her it was different. Neither legal nor entirely illegal was a description that could mean several things, and what it meant specifically would determine what Renee's options were and what her obligations were, and those two things were not always the same. If what Leonard had taken from Nevada in 1941 was gold from a private claim he'd worked without proper title, there were questions of mining law that had long since become historical. If it was gold from a claim he'd had no right to work at all, there were different questions. If any portion of it had been taken from federal land, there were still other questions, though the relevant statutes of the period and their current applicability were a matter Patricia said she'd need to research before opining on. She said, "The most important thing is that you document everything before you open it, and that you open it with a witness. Me, preferably." She looked at the box. "Whatever is in here has been in a cellar for over 80 years. Your legal position is strongest when you can demonstrate that you handled the discovery transparently and correctly from the moment you opened it." Renee said, "Leonard wrote that it was theirs. Whoever came after." Patricia said, "I hear that, and I believe he meant it. But the moral transfer of something doesn't automatically resolve the legal questions around its origin, and the legal questions are what will determine what you can actually do with what you find." She paused. "I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm trying to make sure that whatever is in this box becomes yours cleanly and completely, not encumbered by something that could have been handled properly from the start." Renee looked at the box. She said, "All right." Patricia took a tool from her bag that Renee didn't recognize, a slim piece of steel with a curved end, and worked it into the hasp of the padlock for about 4 minutes with the focused patience of someone who had evidently done this before. The lock gave with a dull snap and fell open. She set it on the table beside the box and looked at Renee. Renee lifted the lid. The smell that came out was of sealed earth and old metal and time, an underground smell, the smell of things kept below the surface for so long they'd taken on the character of the ground itself. She looked at what was inside for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, "Patricia." Patricia came around the table and stood beside her. What was inside the box was gold. Not coins this time, and not the irregular nuggets and flattened pieces from the canvas pouch. This was something between those forms and processed bullion, bars that were not the standardized rectangular bricks of commercial production, but smaller irregular forms, the kind of thing that came from a smelting process conducted privately rather than industrially, the surfaces bearing the minor imperfections of handwork, each one stamped with a simple mark that looked like a maker's identifier rather than a mint designation. There were 22 of them, arranged in 2 even rows of 11, each one approximately the size of a large bar of soap. Renee counted them twice. She thought about what Carl Bremer had told her about melt value, the arithmetic of weight and purity, and the spot price of gold on any given morning. She thought about the weight of the box when she'd lifted it, the way the contents had shifted. She thought about Leonard Marsh in Nevada in 1941, a man who had brought something home that he'd spent the rest of his life unable to openly claim and unable to discard, who had asked his dying wife to leave a letter explaining what it was so that whoever found it would understand before they decided. Patricia photographed everything with the methodical thoroughness Renee had come to expect from her. She photographed the interior of the box from multiple angles, each bar individually, the cavity in the floor where the box had rested, the letter from the workbench. She made notes in the small leather pad she kept in her bag. She was quiet while she worked, the professional quiet of someone assessing a situation carefully before speaking. When she finished, she sat back down across the table and said, "Here is what I know and what I don't know." What she knew. Nevada gold mining in 1941 was a complicated business. The major gold rush era was decades past, but small private operations continued. some with proper Bureau of Land Management claims, some without, some in gray areas that had to do with claim jumping and disputed territory and the particular lawlessness of remote operations during a period when federal enforcement of mining regulations was inconsistent at best. What Leonard Marsh had meant by neither legal nor entirely illegal was consistent with any number of scenarios, not all of which carried the same weight or the same modern implications. What she didn't know, which scenario applied here, that would require research into Nevada mining records from the 1939 to 1942 period, cross-referenced with any operations a Leonard Marsh might have participated in, which was the kind of archival work that was possible, but time-consuming and not guaranteed to produce a clear answer. She said, there is also the question of the stamps on the bars. A metallurgist and a specialist in historic assay marks would be able to identify the origin of those marks, which would tell us considerably more about the provenance and potentially about whether any existing legal claim on this material exists or could exist. Renee said, and if there's no existing claim? Patricia said, then you have what you have. The property conveyed to you in full at purchase. Items contained in the property transferred with it. Dorothy's letter extends the explicit transfer of intent to the cellar room specifically and to what Leonard left in it. If the gold's provenance resolves to something that carries no active legal encumbrance, your position is the same as it was with the coins. If it doesn't, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, we navigate that when we know what we're navigating. I don't want to invent problems before I know the shape of them. She took the box with her when she left. Not all of it. She left the letter, left the photographs, left Renee with a copy of the documentation, but she took the box in a locked case she'd apparently brought for the purpose, which told Renee that Patricia had understood from the voicemail that this was a different category of discovery and had prepared accordingly. Renee stood at the front door and watched her car back down the driveway and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. The situation was what it was. She had done what the situation required, which was to be transparent and careful and to trust the person she'd hired to know what to do with the things she didn't know how to handle. She had learned that in the months since October. She had learned it slowly and sometimes against the grain of her instinct, which was to manage things alone, to not put the weight of her problems on people who hadn't asked to carry them. She went back into the house. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The research took 6 weeks. Patricia worked with a Nevada historian who specialized in 20th century mining and with a federal records archivist at the Bureau of Land Management who was apparently used to fielding queries about historic claims from people who had found things in old houses, which Renee found both surprising and oddly comforting. She worked with a metallurgist who identified the stamp on the bars as consistent with a private assay operation that had been active in a specific region of Elko County, Nevada, from 1938 to 1943. The historian found the operation in county records. It had been a 4-man partnership, licensed, its claim filed properly with the BLM in 1939. All 4 partners were named in the filing. Leonard Marsh was not one of them. Patricia called Renee on a Tuesday evening and said, "Here's what we have." Leonard Marsh had worked for the licensed operation as a hired hand from August 1940 to March 1941. This was documented in the operation's payroll records, which had been deposited with the county and survived. He had been paid wages, which were on record, and had left the employment in March 1941, which was also on record. What was not on record was how he'd come to possess 22 privately smelted bars of gold from an assay operation that bore the mark of that specific partnership. The 3 other partners in the claim had all died without heirs by the mid-1980s. The claim itself had been closed and relinquished to the BLM in 1944 when the operation ceased. There were no surviving parties with standing to make a claim on the material. The BLM records showed no unsettled enforcement actions related to the operation. The period of the statute of limitations for any federal action related to the removal of the material had been exceeded by several decades. Patricia said, "This does not mean Leonard took something that wasn't his. It may mean he was compensated in gold at a time when that was not uncommon in private operations, or that he retained a portion of production in lieu of wages, or that the partnership had arrangements that weren't formally documented. What it means legally is that there is no surviving claimant, no active enforcement issue, and no federal encumbrance on the material." Renee was quiet. Patricia said, "Your position is clean. Everything in that box is yours." She was sitting in the kitchen when she took the call. The afternoon light was coming through the east-facing window. Not the November orange she loved, but the different light of May, greener and more direct, filling the room the way the room was built to be filled. The kitchen table sat under her hands with its refinished grain and its history of being found in a basement and brought back to usefulness. And Renee sat with the phone against her ear and thought about Leonard Marsh driving home from Nevada in 1941 with something in the back of his truck that he carried the weight of for the rest of his life. She thought about how a man who built walls as well as he did, who got the framing right because he believed everything else depended on it, had managed to carry that weight without letting it corrupt the rest of what he built. The house was still standing. The cellar was sound. The family he'd raised there had included a daughter who grew up to write a letter to strangers, trusting them with everything he'd hidden and everything she'd loved. Whatever he'd done or not done in Nevada, the house he'd built after was an honest house. The life he'd built in it had been an honest life. Renee thought there was something in that. Not a complete accounting, not an absolution, but something. She said, "What about the valuation?" Patricia gave her the numbers. The metallurgist had confirmed the purity, which was high, consistent with the direct smelting of raw or without the dilution of commercial processing. The weight, combined with the current gold price and the purity figure, produced a melt value. On top of that, the provenance documented Nevada private assay operation, 1940s, bars in original form with identifiable maker's marks added a collector premium that Patricia's specialist contact had estimated conservatively. The total was a number that exceeded the coin auction result. Renee sat with that for a moment. She had come to this house with $4,380 and the stubbornness her sister, named plainly, and her mother, named otherwise. She had spent the first months learning how to keep a roof over her daughter's head in a structure that had been abandoned by every system responsible for its care. She had found things in the walls and under the floor, and she had handled them carefully and transparently, and with the help of people she'd trusted, and the trust had been repaid. She thought about what she wanted to do with what she had. Not in the abstract, not the categories savings, stability, Maren's education, the things that were obvious and necessary and already in the process of being addressed. She thought about the specific things that had lived in her mind since October as the shape of a different kind of life, the one on the other side of surviving. She had been working at the medical billing office for 8 years. She was good at it, careful and precise, the same qualities that had served her in this house. She had always found the work tolerable rather than interesting, which was a distinction she'd not had the luxury of caring about until now. The distinction felt worth attending to. She had thought, in the weeks since the auction, about the house itself, about what it had been before it became a neglected listing in a county tax database, about what Dorothy had built in it, not the physical structure but the life, the 33 years of family and repair and accumulated knowledge of a place. She thought about the garden she and Maren were growing, which was small now but didn't have to stay small, the property's acre and a half of land still mostly unused, still covered with the wild meadow grass that Maren documented weekly in her bug notebook. She had been thinking about what she wanted to build here. Patricia called again in mid-May to tell her that Paul Hendricks had responded to the letter. He was 63 years old and he lived in Tucson, and he had a son and 2 grandchildren, and he had spent most of his adult life knowing very little about his grandmother Dorothy, who had died in Phoenix in 1989 when he was 27, a woman he remembered as reserved and private and given to long silences in front of windows, the kind of person who seemed to be living partly somewhere else. His mother Carol had told him almost nothing about Dorothy's life before Phoenix, only that she'd had a farm somewhere in the east that she'd left when her husband died and that she didn't talk about it. He had not known about the house. He had not known about what it had held. He had not known about his great-great-grandmother Hilda Kaufman, or the letters, or the museum in Washington where they were now preserved with proper credit to his family name. Patricia had told him the outline in the letter, and he had read it twice and called his son, and then sat alone in his kitchen in Tucson for an hour before he wrote back. He wrote, "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank a stranger for giving my grandmother back to me." Renee read the email Patricia forwarded her and sat with it for a while before she wrote back herself. She wrote, "I want you to know what she left here. Not just the objects, which are accounted for and documented, but the house itself, which she loved in a way that is still visible if you know where to look. She wrote on a wall. She wrote to whoever came after her, and she wrote about the November sunrise through the kitchen window, and about her husband getting the framing right, and about her son James who died in 1969. She trusted the walls to hold what she put in them, and they did. They held for 50 years, and then they gave it to someone who needed it. She paused and thought about what else to say. I would like you to visit, if you ever want to. I think she would have wanted that. I think the house would want it too. He wrote back in 2 days. He said he would come in the fall, if that was all right. He said he'd like to see the wall. The summer that followed was the first summer Renee had spent in a place that was entirely hers, and it had a different texture than any summer before it. Not easier, not free of complication, the house continued to require the daily attention of any old structure. The garden needed more work than 2 people could give it without organization. Maren went through a phase of defiant 6-year-old behavior that required the kind of patient consistency that was hardest to maintain when you were tired. None of that changed. What changed was the ground under it. The quality of the foundation, which she understood now in the way you understood something only after you'd helped build it yourself. She was not afraid of the lease ending. She was not afraid of the rent increasing. She was not tracking account balances with the compressed anxiety of someone who knew that the distance between where she was and where things went wrong was measured in hundreds rather than thousands. The house was hers. The ground under her feet was hers. The future she was building was being built on something she owned. She gave notice at the medical billing office in June. She had thought about this carefully, over months, running the numbers with Patricia's help and her own accounting knowledge, making sure the decision was real rather than the intoxicated impulsiveness of someone who'd come into money and lost their perspective. It was real. The proceeds from the coins and the gold, managed conservatively and with Patricia's guidance about structure and tax treatment, produced an income that exceeded what she'd earned at the billing office. Combined with what she was planning for the property, which was not elaborate but was specific, the math was sound. Her manager at the billing office, a woman named Terry who had supervised her for 6 of her 8 years there, and who had the resigned warmth of someone who'd watched a lot of good employees leave for better things, said, "I'm not surprised. You've been somewhere else in your head for months." Renee said, "I have a house. I'm going to build something in it." Terry said, "Good. You were always too careful for this work. Careful people need something worth being careful about." She spent a week after giving notice doing something she hadn't done in years, which was to sit with the particular silence of unscheduled time and let it tell her what it wanted to contain. She walked the property in the early mornings, the whole 1.5 acres of it, the restored sections and the still wild sections both, learning the shape of it the way you learn the shape of something you were going to work with seriously rather than just live beside. She went into the cellar and stood in Leonard's sealed room and looked at the woodworking bench and thought about what it meant that a man who built as well as he did had kept this space all his life as the room where he put the things he couldn't openly carry. She thought about what she wanted to put here instead. She thought about what the house had been built to hold. She was not entirely sure what she meant by build something until it began to clarify through the summer in the way that plans clarified when you started actually doing them rather than holding them in the abstract. It started with the garden, which she expanded in July into the western portion of the property that had been meadow, turning the wild grass under and building raised beds with the lumber skills she'd been accumulating since October. It continued with the preserving, which Claire had started teaching her the previous fall, and which she now pursued with the focused attention she brought to anything she decided to do properly. The cellar she'd cleared and dried became the storage room it was always meant to be, the shelves filling through summer with the record of what the garden produced. Maren participated with the enthusiasm of someone who had grown up in this house from the age of 3 and considered herself an authority on its capabilities. She had opinions about what should be planted and where, and what the bug population in each bed indicated about soil health, which was information she delivered from her notebooks with the seriousness of a small scientist. She had also, by early August, begun keeping a second notebook separate from the bug documentation, which she called the house notebook, in which she wrote and drew things about the property the way her mother documented repairs and discoveries. Renee found it one evening on the kitchen table and opened it carefully and found inside pencil drawings of each room labeled in Maren's improving handwriting, the garden beds mapped and named, a careful rendering of the cellar stairs with a note that said stairs go down to where Leonard kept the important things, and at the back, a full-page drawing of the bedroom wall with Dorothy's letter reproduced in her daughter's hand. The letters uneven but the words correct, because Maren had read it enough times to have most of it by heart. She set the notebook back where she'd found it and did not mention it, because some things deserve the privacy of being discovered rather than discussed. Maren had also developed a theory about the loose stone in the cellar floor, which she knew about because Renee had told her the version appropriate for a 6-year-old, which was that great-grandpa Leonard had put something important under the floor and Mommy had found it. Maren's theory was that the floor should be celebrated, and she had drawn a design for a marker that she wanted to install beside the loose stone, a small carved piece of wood with the words, "This is where important things were kept." Renee said yes to the marker. Paul Hendricks arrived on a Friday in October, the kind of October day that arrived in the same spirit as the April morning she'd opened the cellar door, clear and cool and entirely itself. He drove a rental car from the airport and pulled into the driveway and sat in it for a moment before he got out, which Renee recognized as the pause of someone encountering something they'd been imagining for months and needing a moment to let the real version replace the imagined one. He was a lean man with white hair and his grandmother's precise way of moving, which Renee recognized from the photographs in Dorothy's trunk even though she'd never met the woman. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house with the expression of someone reading something important. She met him at the car and they shook hands, the slightly formal handshake of strangers who were also something else, and she said, "Welcome." And then, because it was true, she would have been glad you came. He said, "I've been thinking about this house since May, about what it means that it's still standing. Most of it's original," Renee said. "Your great-grandfather got the framing right." Paul Hendricks looked at the front porch, the straight boards, and the solid post where the old post had given out. He looked at the windows with their new glazing and the paint, the pale green that was almost gray in certain lights. He said, she described the paint color in one of her letters. Not this color. Another color she'd chosen, years ago. But the same instinct, she wrote. The same feeling that a house needed to announce itself softly and let what was inside speak louder. Renee had not known about that letter. She stood for a moment with the knowledge of it, the way Dorothy's reach extended still into things she hadn't expected. She showed him the house. She showed him the kitchen first, because she'd made tea and because the kitchen felt like the place to start, the room that was most fully lived in and most fully restored, the table and the light and the particular warmth of a room that was used every day by people who were glad to be in it. She showed him the garden through the east-facing window, the bed she and Maren had built through the summer, the wild corner at the fence line with its perennials that had waded through the abandonment and come back on their own schedule. She showed him the bedroom last. She had not rearranged anything for his visit. The dresser stood against the far wall where she'd moved it in March, its cracked mirror catching the afternoon light. The writing on the south wall was where it had always been, visible now, the faded amber ink on pale plaster, Dorothy's careful handwriting in its even rows from the top of the exposed section to the baseboard. Paul Hendricks stood in front of it for a long time. He read it once from beginning to end without speaking. Then he read it again, and this time Renee could see that he was reading slowly at certain lines, stopping, the way you stopped at the parts that landed differently from the rest. He stopped at the line about James. He stood there for a moment. He said, "She never talked about him. My mother said Dorothy never spoke about James after 1969. Wouldn't hear his name. People thought it meant she'd stopped grieving." He paused. "But she wrote it on the wall." "Yes, she wrote it on the wall where nobody could see it for 50 years. Renee said, "I think that's how she carried things." Not out loud. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She writes about the November light. Through the kitchen window. I see it every year. I bring my daughter down for it." He turned to look at her. "She's 6? She'll be 7 in December." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrived from somewhere deep rather than from the surface, a smile with a whole life behind it. He said, "My grandmother would have loved that. A little girl in this house who watches the light." They sat on the porch after, the way Renee had come to do most evenings when the weather allowed, watching the garden settle into the late afternoon, Maren beside her with her notebook, documenting the final insect activity of the season with the dedication of someone who understood that October was closing time and everything needed to be recorded before it was over. Paul Hendricks sat in the second chair with his tea and looked at the property with the expression of someone who had been given something they hadn't known was missing. He said, "She wrote that she hoped whoever found it would make it a home." Renee looked at the house behind her, at the painted green walls and the straight porch and the east-facing window where the November light would come in 3 weeks, filling the kitchen for 40 minutes with something orange and warm and particular to that hour. She said, "She can stop hoping." Maren looked up from her notebook. "She already knows," she said, with the certainty of 6 years old and a child who had grown up in a house that taught her things. She left the letter so she'd know for sure. Paul Hendricks looked at Maren and then at Renee and then at the garden where the last of the season's color held in the beds they'd built together through a summer of learning what they were capable of. And he did not say anything because there was nothing to add to what had just been said. The wind moved through the meadow grass at the property's edge, the wild grass that Maren called bug territory and Renee had learned to see as something the land chose for itself when left alone. And the October light fell across the whole property the way October light fell, long and golden and full of the particular generosity of a season that knew it was ending. Renee thought about Leonard getting the framing right. She thought about Dorothy writing on a wall and trusting it to hold. She thought about a woman in Frankfurt in 1941 writing a letter to her daughter in America and understanding it might be the last one, and writing it anyway, because some things were worth saying even into silence. She thought about Maren at 3 years old pushing a massive oak dresser with her small hands and calling out in a voice that was not alarmed, not frightened, just interested in what she'd found. "Mom, there's writing on the wall behind the dresser." "And what happened after you listened?" She held her tea in both hands and felt the warmth of it and let the evening come in over the garden the way evenings came, without asking permission, without announcing themselves, simply arriving the way all good things eventually did when the framing was right and the walls were built to hold. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.